Excuse me. I need to clean the room.
It was 1946, and the Second World War was over. Most of Europe lay in ruins. London had endured the relentless bombardment of the Blitz. The time had come to rebuild a home fit for heroes who were returning needing new houses and new jobs. Men were coming back who'd been trained to kill and who'd seen and done awful things. The society was grappling with the challenge of reintegrating them into a country forever changed. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, and Victory in Europe Day finally arrived on the 8th of May. Crowds gathered across London in joyous mood to see King George VI on the balcony of Buckingham Palace and Winston Churchill waving from Whitehall. Even the future Queen Elizabeth II joined in the festivities as she was allowed to wander incognito through the jubilant crowds. And just as the young Elizabeth would take on the role normally held by a man, so too did many other women at this time.
More women are coming into industry every day, and much more varied are their jobs. Indeed, today, women are tackling jobs that were thought impossible a few years ago.
Women's role in World War II was to replace men who had actually gone to war, which of course caused a problem at the end of the war when men came back expecting to take on the jobs that the women had been successfully doing for several years. It was the women who actually built Waterloo Bridge, and they were engaged in that heavy labour. They were replacing the men who were away at war.
But the country was now ready to return to peacetime after the most deadly conflict in human history. 1946 saw the London victory celebrations with military parades marching through the city and a nighttime fireworks display. But amongst all the cheer, some very dangerous individuals were lurking, and the burgeoning British press had plenty of sensational stories to report on.
Really, the early 20th century, it started to accelerate. After W.T. Stead started to expose scandals and things like that, it opened the newspapers much more to murder, and especially after the Second World War, because the British public became very desensitized to horror, because they were used to seeing bombed out sites, dead bodies. So murder became much more palatable to the British public. And of course, Fleet Street always mirrored what people wanted. The Kings of the Crime Reporters were a group called the Murder Gang. People like Norman Jock Ray of the News of the World, Harry Proctor of the Sunday Pictorial, later the Daily Mail, Duncan Webb, and they had enormous power. They were mini celebrities. Some of them were interviewed for the Picture Post and things like that, and they became like household names.
It must have been a relief for most of the returning soldiers to now be reading the newspapers rather than living with the fear of death every day on the battlefield. One serviceman, though, was returning to London, bringing all the savagery of the fighting with him. This man's charming exterior hid a dark and murderous psyche.
Now, I've been instructed by your solicitor, Mr. Neal.
Why shouldn't I plead guilty?
I beg your pardon?
Why should I not plead guilty?
You have a father and mother both alive? A younger brother too, I believe?
Mick. Well then. They keep asking to see me. The warders think I'm cruel for refusing, but I know they'd hate it. I've done enough to them, you see.
Who was Neville Heath? Well, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there were a lot of people who had left the services and who had this sort of military bearing and had had many adventures in the war. Some people talked about their adventures and their exploits, and they were true. A lot of people, perhaps like Neville Heath, had a mysterious background.
Heath had a very lower middle class childhood, and he came from a very normal family. There were no major problems or anything. But from a young age, as a teenager, he showed criminal intent and really theft to start with.
Growing up, he always dreamed of being a pilot and joined the RAF when he was still a teenager. He always tried to act the consummate gentleman, inflating his background and spending money he didn't have. In order to escape bad debts, he went AWOL from the RAF.
It really started because he stole some mess funds while he was in the Air Force. So he went AWOL really to not face the music. He wanted the glamour, he wanted the image, because of course at that time, servicemen were heroes, but he wasn't really cut out because he was anti-authority. He was really criminally minded from quite a young age.
I'd ring for refreshments, but the service here,
Oh, that's quite all right.
it's not exactly the Savoy.
Tell me about your first court-martial in 37. No, thank you.
You sure? Get all the smokes I need. Be pretty browned off if I didn't.
You were dismissed from the service, were you not?
The old buffers. It was a lark.
A lark?
Flew my plane under a bridge.
Really? Goodness.
It was a damn tricky thing, actually. Even to attempt it, you have to have real skill. I mean, be a real pilot. My superiors weren't so keen, of course.
No, I imagine not.
It was jolly good fun, though, mind you.
Neville Heath went on to have a lot more fun as he began a career as a petty criminal. But time after time, his golden looks and charm helped win over the authorities. It seemed with a ready excuse and the promise of future good behavior, Heath could wriggle out of anything.
He had all the wartime glamour, the blonde hair. He had the manner of a dashing pilot, a hero. He had that glamorous aura which attracted a lot of women.
He was somebody who used his appearance enormously. He was blue-eyed, square-jawed, dark blonde-haired, cleft-chinned, you know, the kind of Cary Grant thing, but with blonde hair. And he was also very elegant and very confident. And this is how he managed to hoodwink so many people.
He was a con man on quite a grand scale. I mean, the number of names he uses is Major Rupert Brooke, or else he's won the Military Cross. They're all facades behind which he can exploit a number of frauds. Heath and fraud are linked all the way through his career.
But his luck ran out, and he was sentenced to time in Borstal, an old-fashioned type of correctional facility designed to reform delinquent youth. Unlike most, he thrived in the environment.
Wasn't so bad, I suppose. I could still get my Daily Telegraph. Well, it's rather like being back at school. Housemasters and prefects and all the rest.
I understand the governor grew quite attached to you.
Old Jack Joyce, yes. Oh, he was a good sort.
He supported your application to the Air Force in 39, didn't he?
Yes, well, I was house captain, you know. Keeping all those receptions in line. Those were the novices, the new boys. I tell them, no cursing, no brawling, no acting the goat, not when I'm around. There were some real swines, but they knew where they were at with me.
Then, of course, the war came.
Yes.
You tried to re-enlist, and the Air Force rejected you.
Bloody ministry bureaucrats did. Such bull. You'd think, outbreak of the war, this great battle approaching, they'd need all the good pilots they had, but no. No. They were up there and I was down here. One of their best pilots, packed and ready. God, it was maddening. It's a damn miracle we won that war.
Heath would eventually achieve his ambition and make his way into a cockpit after a truly remarkable journey across the globe. But by the time he finally returned home at the end of the war, he had transformed into a truly vicious individual. No one was safe while Neville Heath was allowed to roam free. Neville Heath had dreams of flying with the Royal Air Force, but those dreams had been dashed due to his troubling behavior. In September 1939, World War II had broken out, but Heath was rejected by the RAF yet again. He joined the far less glamorous Royal Army Service Corps as a private instead. He was stationed in the Middle East, but was soon court-martialed for the second time in his life and sent home in disgrace aboard the SS Multoon. But when the ship docked in South Africa, Heath seized his chance and escaped. The country offered him a new beginning. He eventually volunteered for the South African Air Force under the typically grand name of James Robert Cadogan Armstrong.
Neville Heath had a very checkered military career. He was court-martialed 3 times for using checks, defaulting on payments, misuse of uniforms and medals. So there was this mix of glamour and fraud throughout his career.
It was really in South Africa where he started to show his future modus operandi, and he posed as numerous people there. His first persona was Captain, Selway, MC, Military Cross, and he would really inhabit the role. He had a limp, he had an eyeglass. He was really an actor.
Heath's acting skills had worked well for him in South Africa. He even achieved his ambition of flying missions during the war, but his true identity was soon revealed, and in January 1946 he was deported back to England. On his return to the UK, he saw one glimmer of hope, the London School of Air Navigation. He intended to become a commercial pilot. He studied hard and excelled, passing all the exams required for his license, but then his previous mistakes ensnared him once again. His court-martial and dismissal from the RAF was discovered. Heath was told he could not become a commercial pilot.
I've made a few slips in life, yes, all chaps have. But the Air Ministry refused to let me forge ahead. There's no reasoning with them, none at all. These congenital idiots. I swear, that's what led to all this. I worked damn hard for that license.
And after that, what did you do after their refusal?
I just drifted around for a fortnight or so, until the 20th.
Heath hid the failure from his parents. The only things he had left now, the only things he was good at, were drinking and womanizing. He would pursue them both in an increasingly extreme manner. And it would prove deadly for one Marjorie Gardner. She'd been born to a good middle-class family in Sheffield, but was now living in London. She was a talented artist, but always struggled for money after being separated from her unreliable husband. She was now in an on-off relationship with an alcoholic.
She worked as a film extra from time to time. She's said to have something of a bohemian lifestyle.
Her life went into a spiral, and she was really at the mercy of men she met.
She clearly enjoyed the new freedoms offered to women by the war and was drawn to the bright lights of the city. You might call her a good-time girl, but she certainly wasn't a prostitute.
We left the pub at about 8, I suppose, and then went on to the Normandy for dinner. Do you know it? It's in Knightsbridge.
I'm afraid not.
We must have left at about 9:30, maybe 10 o'clock. Then we took a cab to the Panama Club. I'm a member there. We sat down, just the two of us, and had a few drinks. We must have left at about 20 past midnight.
And returned to the Pembridge Court Hotel.
Someday we'll build a home on a hilltop high, you and I, shiny and new, a cottage that two can fill.
Do you remember anything of what occurred in the room?
No.
Nothing at all?
I woke up and she was lying there. I don't remember anything else. I've already told you all this. You know exactly what happened.
Heath may have claimed he was unable to remember what happened with Marjorie Gardner in room 4 of the Pembridge Court Hotel. But her body told the truth of what horrors had occurred. The post-mortem was performed by noted pathologist Keith Simpson. It showed that Marjorie had been the victim of a savage attack. She'd been bound and probably gagged. 17 whip lacerations were found on her body, and bruising showed she'd been punched in the face at least twice. Given the extent of her other injuries, we must hope that these blows knocked her out, because she was then subjected to the most horrifically violent and sadistic sexual attack. Her suffering was eventually ended by suffocation, probably with a pillow.
It was extremely violent, a brutal, frenzied attack. She had lacerations, she'd been lashed with a whip.
From a police point of view, one of the interesting things was that there were wheals across her back. And these marks or scars had a peculiar diamond pattern. And when the pathologist was discussing the case with the detective, he said, if you can find that weapon, then you'll have your man.
Neville Heath would prove a difficult man to track down, though, given his extensive experience of travelling under multiple aliases. Numerous women would cross his path as he made his way around the country. One of them would meet a gruesome end. In 1946, Neville Heath had returned home to England after years abroad during the course of World War II. He had brought back all the savagery of the conflict with him when he murdered Marjorie Gardner at the Pembridge Court Hotel. But Marjorie hadn't been the only woman he brought back to his room. Just 4 days earlier, he'd stayed there with Yvonne Simmons, who'd been part of the war effort, just like Heath.
She was staying in London at the Overseas Club. She met Neville Heath, probably impressed by this military bearing, and he put himself over as a lieutenant colonel. He took her out to dinner and persuaded her to come back to the hotel room. They spent the night in the hotel room with nothing of a violent action occurring at all.
Heath had seen his new fiancée, Yvonne Simmons, off on the train back to her parents in Worthing after they spent the night together at his hotel.
She was a pretty thing. Tall, slender. I think London rather dazzled her. You know these small-town girls.
Not quite as you do, I imagine.
You're from London, though, aren't you?
Wimbledon.
Oh, my parents live there. Cambridge man.
Oxford.
I always cheer the other lot during the boat race, I'm afraid. I fancy you were a bit of a rower, though.
College late, athletics too for university.
Truly?
Yes, a long jumper a long time ago.
I don't foresee much long jumping in my future either. Short dropping, perhaps.
Not if I have anything to say about that, Mr. Heath.
The morning after he murdered Marjorie Gardner, Heath was on the run. The police would soon be on his tail, though, as he had signed into the hotel under his real name. He was travelling to Worthing to see Yvonne and her family. The amorous young man charmed her parents at the local golf club and then whisked her off to a dinner dance. The charming, war hero, charismatic facade showed no hint of the callous killer beneath. But events were playing on his mind, and after more drinks at a club after dinner, he told Yvonne a terrible secret. There had been a murder in the room they'd shared at Pembridge Court, he said. A woman had been killed.
Heath was doing everything to not tell Yvonne that he was with another woman. So he said he met a man who asked him for his hotel room key because he wanted to entertain a young woman. And he said he gave him the key. He completely cut himself out of the murder. And he was able to do that because, as well as being a psychopath, Heath was almost definitely a sociopath.
The next morning, newspapers were full of police appeals for Neville Heath to come forward. Yvonne and her parents were shocked, or who wouldn't be?
The hunt began for Heath. And it's at this point Heath does something quite astonishing. He writes to the police, giving his name, and saying that he knew Marjorie Gardner. He'd been to the same hotel with her, but he'd loaned her the key to his room. Heath had then gone back to the hotel later on and found her in the room. And he said that he'd even got the whip with which the injuries had been inflicted on her, and he would actually send this to the police.
I think in Heath's delusional mind, because he spent so many years telling lies and being believed, I think he honestly thought that the police might believe him. I honestly do think that. I think that he thought his version might be accepted.
This letter may seem strange, but Heath had form for this kind of thing. Often, when committing crimes or indiscretions, he'd written these crawlingly exculpating letters afterwards. These strange common courtesies often seemed to help him get away with things, but it wouldn't help him this time. The police pressed on with their investigation. Meanwhile, Heath was having fun. Unbeknownst to police, on the evening of Sunday the 23rd of June, Heath had arrived at the Tollard Royal Hotel in Bournemouth. He signed the register under the name Rupert Robert Brooke and told the receptionist he would be staying a week.
Thank you.
By now, the police had tracked Heath as far as Worthing. There, they interviewed the manager at the Ocean Hotel, as well as Yvonne Simmons and her parents. But beyond Worthing, however, the trail was going cold. The Tollard Royal Hotel, where Heath checked in under this false name Group Captain Brooke, was situated overlooking the beach. It's a smart hotel for the better sort. Just Heath's kind of place.
He met Peggy Waring in Bournemouth. She was a young woman that Heath was chasing, and he actually proposed to her at one point, but she refused. And there was really a cat and mouse game going on between them. She was playing hard to get. She found him attractive, but there's something about him she didn't quite trust. But they did meet several times in Bournemouth, and they sent each other letters as well.
So for about 13 days, Heath was on the loose, and there was no public identification of him. It's this point he meets a young girl called Doreen Marshall. She's 21.
Doreen had survived a terrible V-1 rocket attack that had reduced most of her street to rubble and killed 13 people. While her family escaped with their lives, the trauma left its mark on young Doreen, a burst of grey hair at her right temple.
Heath's version is that he was out walking in Bournemouth. He met Doreen Marshall and her friend, and then he struck up a conversation with them, and he arranged to meet Doreen later. She seemed to have liked him at first, but as she was becoming increasingly anxious because his behaviour was becoming very pushy. And the night porter of the Tollard Royal Hotel where Heath was staying witnessed her becoming a little bit panicky.
This would sadly be the last time anyone but Heath saw Doreen alive.
I have no recollection of going near the chine. Next thing I remember, I was lighting a cigarette. As I went to flick the match away, I saw blood on my hands. I'd left the hotel with her. I knew that. But where she was, or what happened, I was on the beach, on the sand. How late it was, I don't know. I didn't know what to do. I washed my hands in the sea and then walked back along the beach to the hotel. It was quiet. There was nobody about. I knew something dreadful had happened.
Doreen Marshall's sudden disappearance raised suspicions about the mysterious character of Rupert Brooke, who'd only just arrived in Bournemouth. The police, who were hunting for the killer of Marjorie Gardner, would soon realize that Neville Heath and Rupert Brooke were one and the same. When Heath was finally captured, his extraordinary and frightening life story would be revealed to both his legal counsel and a fascinated public, who were fed all the details by the burgeoning British press. Neville Heath was staying at the Tollard Royal Hotel in Bournemouth under the false name Captain Rupert Brooke. Doreen Marshall was at the hotel lounge as well, but she was now missing.
Captain Brooke?
When Heath went back to the hotel that night, he used a ladder to get into his hotel room. And when the porter came up to check, they saw his shoes there. And at breakfast the following morning, he told everybody that he'd played this prank on the doorman. But in fact, That created an alibi in his mind over what he had done and how he had attacked Doreen Marshall.
Fears over Doreen Marshall's disappearance were growing, and on Friday the 5th of July, the manager at the Tollard Royal Hotel received a telephone call from his counterpart in town at the Norfolk Hotel, where Doreen had been staying. She had last been seen in a taxi heading for the Tollard Royal.
The hotel staff at Bournemouth were very concerned about Neville Heath, or Group Captain Brooke, as he had signed himself in the register under. And because they knew that Doreen Marshall was missing, they knew that Heath had had some connection with her. They said, well, you really should go to the police, which indeed he did do.
The man police believed was Group Captain Brooke seemed a helpful witness. Calm, courteous, and upfront, with nothing to hide. There was no reason to detain him, nor any reason to think there was anything wrong with Doreen's disappearance. She was on holiday, after all, and might have made an impromptu trip. She was expected to show up eventually, but a certain resemblance was nagging at their memory.
Inspector Constable Souter actually had a photograph of Neville Heath, which had been circulated to the police forces, and said, well, actually, we want you to stay here just to check for a bit longer until my detective inspector comes.
The Bournemouth police were under pressure to release the man, though. Wasn't he a gentleman, an honest serviceman who'd given his word? Their superiors wanted him freed, but D.I. Gates couldn't shake the conviction that this was the man the entire country was looking for. All they had to do was delay long enough till the information came through. But Group Captain Brooke had already given them a bit of information they could look into. He had told the police he was from an aerodrome in Leicester. He even gave them the name of his chief, a man called Walters. Well, this was something they could look into right away.
Eventually, Reg Spooner from Scotland Yard came down and they identified Neville Heath as the man they wanted to interview and arrested him for the murder of Marjorie Gardner. In the course of searching Neville Heath, they found a number of things. One was a rail ticket that Doreen Marshall had used. Another in his luggage was the whip and some blood-stained clothing, and there was some hair on the whip that corresponded with Marjorie Gardner. And so it was very clear at that stage that Neville Heath was clearly connected and had possession of the murder weapon.
Spooner charged Heath with the murder of Marjorie Gardner. There was still, though, no sign of Doreen. It was the coverage of Heath's arrest in the press that helped lead to the discovery of the body of Doreen Marshall. A young waitress named Kathleen Evans thought she was just taking her dog for a walk. But the next day, when she read the papers, her mind went back to the strange swarm of flies she had encountered. She revisited the location with her father. They discovered the clothing and informed the police. Doreen's body was soon found.
It was found concealed in some bracken. She'd been stripped naked, her hands tied behind her back. She'd been savagely beaten. Heath had almost certainly stripped himself naked before the attack because there was so much blood. Then, having committed the attack, he'd gone into the sea, washed himself, and got rid of the knife.
Charged with the murder of Marjorie Gardner, Heath's trial began on the 24th of September 1946. This wasn't his first appearance at the Old Bailey. It was here in 1938 that he'd been sentenced for robbery. But these charges were on an entirely different scale.
Why should I not plead guilty?
Mr. Heath, there is no kindness to your family in throwing your life away. A guilty plea is accepting that you were in your right mind when these murders were committed. Do you want it to be said that your parents raised a man to commit such crimes? Is that how you want Mick to think of you? And he to think himself as a child of the same parents?
Mick's different, he knows better.
But it's only human to wonder, is it not, what he too might be capable of. This is your opportunity, your one opportunity, to prove to Mick and your parents that the man who committed these vile murders is not the real Neville Heath they know. That would be a true kindness.
All right. Put me down as not guilty, old boy.
Heath's counsel, J.D. Caswell, had developed a reputation for handling infamous murder cases that generated a lot of press attention at the time, but nothing quite like the story of the lady killer, Neville Heath.
I think the way the press covered Heath was wrong. I know for a fact that circulation of the Sunday Pictorial increased by about 40%. There was a massive interest in Heath, and it certainly increased Harry Proctor's stock in Fleet Street. Proctor really got the nitty-gritty of Heath's story from prison. You know, he spent time with him in prison, he spoke to him, so he got the exclusive. And Heath was very much shown as a lady killer in the jaunty way of that word. He was dashing, you know, he was the airman. He was almost seen like a Terry Thomas type character. But the problem is what he did was monstrous.
With the evidence against Heath so overwhelming, his defense did not deny that he was the killer. Instead, they claimed the murders were proof of insanity. They did not hide Heath's previous wrongdoings. Instead, they revealed them in court, arguing the crimes were steadily escalating ones, a progressive mania that finally led to murder.
I think he was faced with a situation that a lot of murderers would have faced, that actually they were facing the death penalty if they were convicted. If they could prove insanity in some form, then actually they stood a lot better chance of being reprieved.
You might think he was insane, but the thing is, in legal terms, he wasn't insane under the Norton rules, which states that you have to not know what you're doing is wrong at the moment of death, and that's very difficult to prove.
A number of people in his situation did actually try to plead insanity with, you know, a wide variety of different success rates.
And the problem with Heath was that he made so many efforts to cover up after both murders, and he told so many lies that it showed that he did know what he was doing was legally wrong, if not morally wrong.
Will you be calling me to give evidence?
I do not think at the current time that that would be our best course of action.
Concerned I won't see him mad enough for them, Mr. Caswell.
We're not contesting your involvement in the murders. It is a question of your state of mind. And on that we will of course present the jury with expert opinion from the most eminent authorities. A doctor has been recommended. He practiced psychotherapy at Broadmoor. I'm arranging for him to visit. He shall want to conduct several interviews with you.
Their key witness was Dr. William Henry de Barg Hubert, a specialist in psychiatry. It was a disastrous appearance. He ended up suggesting that all crimes are excusable if the person can't help themselves. Even Heath dismissed his own witness. He passed a note to the defense insisting he'd never suggested being excused on the grounds of insanity. Indeed, it appeared that at this point, Heath had a death wish. If so, the wish was granted. How do we account for the crimes of Neville Heath? His life had always been one of lies and scams, but somehow, whatever the scrape, he always managed to wriggle free. After the war, though, he became a deeply twisted and vicious individual. But he maintained his playboy facade to the very end. When he was offered the customary glass of whiskey to settle his nerves before execution, he calmly replied, "Under the circumstances, you might make that a double." John Christie stands as one of the most notorious killers in history. The case of the unassuming little man with a terrifying psyche remains debated to this day. It was a morbid tale that horrified the public, but at the same time spurred enormous press attention. A serial killer managed to wriggle free of the law as an innocent man was sent to the gallows for his crimes. In this two-part documentary, we will delve into the world of post-war Britain, where sensational murder stories dominated the headlines. London was home to a terrifying collection of killers. The acid bath murderer John George Haigh was on the loose at the same time as Christie. But as these killers were tracked down and brought to justice, attitudes towards capital punishment were being changed by the troubling case of Timothy Evans and the public outcry to the executions of Derek Bentley and Ruth Ellis. The times were changing indeed. Rillington Place would become one of the most notorious addresses in London's history. In the early 1940s, it was in one of the most run-down areas of the capital, Notting Hill. One of the tenants residing there at that time was John Christie. Christie was born in 1899 in a village near Halifax, West Yorkshire. He was from a large family and had a troubled relationship with his father. It was in adolescence, though, that Christie's sexual problems would develop. His impotence would haunt him for his entire life and may even be the cause of his violent and murderous behavior. His sexual failures soon became public knowledge.
He would meet girls and they'd have a snog and it would go further. He failed to perform several times.
He was called Can't Do It Christie or No Dick Reggie because as a young man he was unable to perform sexually. And the word got round, and so friends taunted him about his lack of sexual prowess. This was a reputation that clung to him for all of his life.
Perhaps eager to conquer his inadequacy with the First World War raging on the continent, Christie enlisted in the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derby Regiment of the British Army. He was just 17. In the last months of the war, Christie was posted to France. Shortly after he arrived at the front, however, Christie was caught in a gas attack. Mustard gas was used extensively during the First World War. Although initially deployed by the Germans, by the end of the conflict, both sides were using the vicious chemical weapon against each other.
He'd been exposed to an attack of mustard gas, and for about 3 years or so, he could hardly speak. He lost his voice, and this was a problem which did come back to him from time to time.
Christie has said various things, but we don't really know for sure whether that really affected him. And certainly he was operating at a sort of fairly sensible level in various employments he had. So it wasn't anything that would bring him into the category of being anything other than completely responsible for his criminal actions.
Following the end of World War I, Christie married Ethel Simpson in Halifax, but their early years together had been unhappy. Christie moved to London alone in 1924, but almost a decade later, the couple reconciled, and in 1937, they moved into a flat in Notting Hill.
It's a very fashionable part of London now, but then Notting Hill was very seedy and run down.
The house itself, one day to be so infamous, was similarly dilapidated. Christie's prospects were not looking good either, as he had an extensive criminal record at this point. He had served time in prison for theft and violent assault. But when World War II came along in 1939, a new opportunity opened up for him.
During the Second World War, he was a War Reserve constable. So he was given a uniform. He patrolled the streets, calling out people's attention if the light was showing, warning them blackout, and that was his role.
He was somebody who needed to feel a sense of power, so he was very proud of his uniform. He would make sure it was absolutely immaculate. At that time, a special constable during the war in London had a kind of elevated status because people in the community looked to them for help, but he really used that to his advantage.
For perhaps the first time in his life, Christie was in a position of power. It transformed him, and he embarked on an affair with a co-worker. When the woman's husband discovered the illicit romance, he gave Christie a violent beating. Soon after, Christie carried out his first killing.
Ruth Fuest was from Austria, and she'd been a nurse, but she was working in London as a part-time munitions worker.
Ruth Fuest had fled to England after Hitler annexed her homeland in 1938. She was reported missing by her landlady, but in truth her absence was not otherwise much noticed. She was, after all, an unmarried foreigner who had lived at over a dozen addresses in just 4 years. She had no family in London and few friends. Given the war, it is perhaps not surprising that her disappearance was not investigated further. By 1944, Christie was already targeting his next victim. At this time, he was working as a clerk in a radio factory. It was here that he would first meet a new colleague, Muriel Eady. Knowing she was a hypochondriac, Christie preyed on her fears and wormed his way into her confidence. He convinced her that he had the medical knowledge to cure her chest problems.
Hello, love.
Hello, Mr. Christie. Oh, it's horrible outside. It goes right through you.
Yes, I've hardly been out all week.
You're feeling better now, though?
Oh, much. Much.
Because we missed you at work.
We can have a nice cup of tea afterwards. And you can tell me all the gossip I've missed. Come on through.
Mrs. Christie not home?
No, Ethel is out. Shopping. Why don't you take a seat there? That's right.
Is this it then?
No, don't.
Sorry.
It's quite all right. It's just a little sensitive, you understand? Now, this will be just the thing for your catarrh. Cleared my bronchitis right up.
It's very kind of you. I get so bad in this weather. I'm coughing all day and night.
Yes, the damp. Not good for the chest. Constricts the bronchial passages, you understand?
You have a word for everything, don't you, Mr. Christie?
That's what my medicine does. Unblocks those passages.
Smells a bit like Friar's balsam.
Are you prying into my secret recipe, Muriel?
Oh, no.
Well, it does share some common ingredients, but Friar's balsam doesn't have the really good stuff that's in mine. Now, are you ready? Just sit yourself back. Close your eyes now, Muriel. Just relax, that's right. Breathe, nice and deeply. You'll soon be able to feel it. That's it, just breathe. Breathe. Lovely.
It's nice, this.
Now, you might start feeling just a touch dizzy, but that's all right. You sat down with me. It's just a sign the medicine's beginning to work.
Mr. Christie.
Shh. Keep breathing. That's it. It's working. Breathe. Breathe.
As World War II was coming to a close, the murderous reign of John Christie was just beginning. He would manage to avoid capture for almost a decade, but when new tenants came to stay at 10 Rillington Place, his true nature was in danger of being revealed. John Christie had devised a sinister technique that would enable him to kill without confrontation or violence. That night, he moved the body temporarily into the washhouse at the back of 10 Rillington Place, before finally burying Muriel fully clothed in the garden beside his earlier victim. Unlike Ruth First, though, Muriel was missed. However, amid the flurry of V1 and V2 bombings that year, it was sadly assumed by friends and family that Muriel had been killed in such an attack. There was little investigation. Christie had escaped any suspicion yet again. The end of the war in 1945 should have brought some much-needed respite for the citizens of London, but the truth was, several other serial killers were on the loose, including the acid bath murderer, and a string of horrifying deaths were about to take place. In 1946, the chalk pit murder and the mysterious figure of Thomas Lee grabbed the country's attention. Lee had been a successful politician in Australia whose political opponents had a worrying habit of disappearing or apparently jumping off cliffs. Whilst in the UK, he and an accomplice had been convicted in court of kidnapping, torturing and killing a man and leaving his body in a chalk pit in Surrey. Lee was later declared insane and sent to Broadmoor. At the same time, the gruesome crimes of the lady killer Neville Heath also captured the British public's attention, but John Christie managed to remain undetected. In March 1948, new neighbours moved into 10 Rillington Place, a young couple named Timothy and Beryl Evans, who soon welcomed a baby called Geraldine. They would set in motion a chain of events that would threaten to expose Christie's crimes to the world and send an innocent man to the gallows.
Timothy Evans was born on the 20th of November 1924 in Merthyr Vale in Wales. He had learning difficulties and was prone to tantrums. He often lied about his own life story in order to boost his confidence. That would prove an unfortunate trait when he was eventually accused of murder.
Timothy Evans was, in the terms of that time, simple-minded. He'd had learning problems from a young age. He was working as a van driver in London at the time, and he met Christie and his wife Ethel when him and his wife Barel went to 10 Rillington Place, Christie's house, because they were looking for somewhere to live. And they went to view a room on the second floor.
The Evans marriage was a strained one. There were constant issues with debt, and it didn't help that both Beryl and Timothy were quite bad with money.
Beryl became pregnant for the second time in the autumn of 1949, but their strained financial situation and their volatile relationship meant that the couple were considering an abortion. However, the procedure in those days was far from straightforward. This was a decision that wouldn't be taken lightly.
In working class districts like this, if pills couldn't be obtained, standard method of abortion would have been a hot bath, a bottle of gin and a knitting needle. Gin was known as mother's ruin for that reason.
Women in that situation were at the mercy of backstreet doctors who were not always trained. And Christie's a prime example. I mean, he knew nothing about how to perform an abortion at all. He basically gassed her, like he did with some of his other victims, to put her to sleep.
Timothy Evans was strongly opposed to the idea from the start, but was persuaded by Beryl and eventually agreed to the procedure. They didn't have to look far to find someone who claimed he could carry out the operation. Initially, it seemed fortuitous that their quiet, unassuming neighbor claiming to have a medical background was more than happy to help. But for John Christie, this was an opportunity. Whilst Timothy Evans was at work, Christie prepared his formula, and like with Muriel Eady before her, he used coal gas to render Beryl unconscious.
Tim, Mr. Christie, how did it all go? Sounds quiet enough.
I think it might be best if we spoke upstairs.
What is it?
Why don't you go on up? I'll come behind.
Right.
Her stomach. It was septic poison, do you understand? Nothing could be done.
How long? When?
At about 3 o'clock. Another day, and she'd have to have gone to hospital.
What did you do?
What you asked me to?
I didn't ask for this.
You asked for my help, Tim. I did say there was a risk. She was septic poisoned.
What does that mean? I have to call a doctor. Someone. I don't know.
That's could get me into all sorts of trouble, Tim. Just for trying to help.
Well, I can't just leave her lying there.
It could look black for you.
What?
Well, You and Barel have been quarrelling a lot recently, and in the street. People will have seen, you understand? Tim, they will think that you disposed of her.
But I never wanted this. I told her, I said, I never wanted this. What am I going to do?
You need to remain calm, Tim.
But I said, and now I have to feed the baby.
Breathe.
What am I going to do, Mr. Christie?
Breathe. Nice and deeply. Now, tomorrow, you just get up and go to work as normal.
What about Geraldine?
I'll see about someone to take care of the baby. Don't you worry about her. You go to work.
I go to work
as normal. Now, we're going to have to move Barel. I've opened up Mr. Kitchener's flat. We can lay her down there for now. I know just what to do. I was a police officer during the war, and I know about these things, you understand? You need to be strong, Tim, for Barel's sake and for the baby.
Yes.
Now, let's sort out something for Geraldine to eat, and we can have a cup of tea, yes?
Right. Right.
The murder of Barel was just the beginning of the tragic tale of Timothy Evans. By exploiting Evans' weaknesses and inflating his own life history, Christie would meticulously take away everything Evans held dear, the outcome of which would see a miscarriage of justice which would have a deep historic impact. Timothy and Barel Evans, along with their daughter Geraldine, had moved into a flat at 10 Rillington Place. But after becoming pregnant again, Barel sought an abortion, something their neighbor, John Christie, was all too happy to carry out. Christie had no knowledge of such a procedure and instead gassed Barel, physically abused her, and then killed her. Her lifeless body was discovered by Timothy Evans on his return from work. Little is known about the events which unfolded in that house during the days following Barel's death. But Christie immediately began exploiting Evans' low intelligence. He manipulated him, preyed on his emotions of guilt, panic, and anger, and filled his mind with alternate versions of events. Amongst this confusion, Evans fled back home to Wales, alone.
Christie managed to persuade Timothy Evans that he would be better off moving out and carrying on his life on his own and putting his married life and his daughter behind him in his memory.
He goes to Wales to family, and he gives various excuses as to why Barel is not with him.
Timothy Evans continued lying about his life. He told some people that his wife and daughter had gone to Bristol, and to some others he said they'd gone to Brighton. On the 21st of November, Timothy Evans returned to London. He claimed it was to inquire after the welfare of his baby daughter, whom he'd left in the care of John Christie. Having received assurances of her welfare, he returned home to Wales. But stricken with guilt, on November the 30th, he went to the police station in Merthyr Tydfil and confessed that he had disposed of his wife. Evans was arrested on suspicion of murder.
He went to the police and told them that his wife had been put down a drain. The police went to the address and they searched the drains and couldn't find anything.
However, a later search led the police to a truly grim discovery. The bodies of Barel Evans and baby Geraldine Evans were found hidden in the wash house at the rear of the building. The other two bodies, buried in the garden, remained undiscovered. Beryl Evans and Geraldine had both been strangled. Indeed, the tie used to extinguish little Geraldine's life was still wrapped around her neck. Evans was transported to Notting Hill Police Station. His first moments there were defining ones. Still reeling from the traumatizing confirmation of his family's deaths, he was questioned at length by detectives. But the statement that emerged was radically different from his earlier accounts. His trial was to begin in just a few weeks.
Is your name Timothy John Evans?
Yes, sir.
How old are you?
25.
Did you strangle your baby daughter Geraldine?
No, sir.
Were you in any way responsible for her death?
No, sir.
When did you first know that she was dead?
When I come to Notting Hill Police Station and Inspector Jennings told me.
Did you strangle your wife?
No, sir.
Were you in any way responsible for her death?
No, sir.
With respect to your daughter, Geraldine, which is the principal matter we are considering today, have you ever harmed her?
No, sir.
Were you fond of her?
Yes, sir.
In his third confession, made at Notting Hill Police Station, Timothy Evans had said he alone was responsible for his wife's death, and that he had returned from work on Tuesday the 8th of November, argued with Beryl, hit her, grabbed a rope, and then strangled her impulsively. But serious questions have been raised about this third confession.
He felt as if he'd lost his old life and he was in a corner, and he felt immense guilt as well for letting his wife have the abortion, which led to her death. Really, he was led by the police. He had a low IQ. He was very impressionable, and they were able to put him in a corner.
On a personal note, I was a policeman at one time, and I can remember reading for the first time Timothy Evans' statement. And as I read it, I could hear my instructor, how you lay out a statement. And I can remember sitting there thinking, time, date, place, name, age, occupation, address. And as I went through the statement, I thought, the policeman's written this. Evans could never have written this. It's a policeman's statement. That's always stuck with me, that memory of reading for the first time Timothy Evans' statement.
Timothy Evans later changed his account yet again and insisted it was Christie who was responsible for the deaths.
Is it true that one evening, when you came home from work, Christie said he wanted to chat with you about your wife taking tablets?
Yes, sir.
And that he, Christie, knew that she was trying to get rid of the baby?
That's right, sir.
Did he say anything else, Christie, to you?
Well, he turned around and told me that if my wife and myself had gone to him in the first place, he could have done the job without any trouble at all, sir.
What did you say to that?
I told him I wasn't interested.
Where were you speaking? Where were you when this conversation took place?
In his front room, sir.
Did he say anything about his ability to do such a thing?
Well, he mentioned it, that he had done jobs with other young women before, sir.
Did he say whether he had been successful or not?
He said he had been successful.
He said he had been successful?
Yes, sir.
Did he show you anything? Did you ask him anything about his medical knowledge?
He has shown me medical books, sir.
He has shown you a medical book?
Yes, sir.
Can you read?
No, sir.
Can you tell my lord and the jury what was in that book that he showed you?
Well, it had diagrams of men and women's bodies, sir.
Did he say anything about himself with regard to his medical knowledge?
Well, he said that he had been training for a doctor before the war, sir, but had to give it up owing to an accident.
Did he say what sort of accident?
No, sir, and I did not ask him.
Did you ask him how he would bring about an abortion?
I did, but he would not tell me. He just said only him and a doctor would know how to do that sort of thing.
Police, however, remained convinced that they had their man. The hot-tempered, heavy-drinking, inveterate liar of a husband seemed a far likelier killer than the meek and bespectacled inhabitant of the downstairs flat.
The key witness for the prosecution was Evans' apparently upstanding fellow tenant, John Christie. It was his first appearance at the Old Bailey in a capital trial, but it wouldn't be his last.
John Reginald Christie, what is your occupation?
Ledger clerk.
Do you live at 10 Rillington Place, North Kensington?
Yes.
You live in a flat on the ground floor, as shown in our plan. Is the first floor occupied when he is there by Mr. Kitchener? And the floor above, was that occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Evans and their baby girl?
Yes.
You knew them, did you, as neighbours?
Yes.
In the early part of November last year...
The backyard, is that common to all three flats?
Yes.
The other tenants of the flats have use of that backyard?
Yes, sir.
How did they get to it, Mr. Christie?
Down the stairs and through part of the hall to the back door.
Through your front door?
No, through the hall. And there's a back door leading into the yard. They pass our kitchen window, and it's the first turning on the left past there.
How would neighbours get to the backyard without coming through your flat?
They were self-contained flats. We occupied 3 rooms. They would come down the stairs from their own flats.
Well, so that the jury can see. They would come down the stairs in the middle of your flat.
Yes, and turn sharp left.
Turn left at the bottom of the stairs?
Yes, and then turn right and into the yard.
Is that back door kept open or unlocked?
Yes, unlocked.
So the tenants of the other 2 flats could get to the backyard if they wanted?
Yes.
John Christie gave evidence against him that he'd heard bumps and scraping as if bodies were being dragged upstairs.
He was extremely important. He pointed the finger at Tim from day one. Because Christie, being a special constable, was seen as a safe pair of hands, trustworthy.
Nobody then knew the truth about Christie. Nobody knew of the 2 women he had already murdered and the victims yet to come. And nobody in court that cold week in January could have predicted the case before them would become one of the most controversial and debated of the 20th century. The trial of Timothy Evans began at the Old Bailey on Wednesday, the 11th of January, 1950. The police were convinced he had murdered his wife Barel and his daughter Geraldine. Both had been strangled, Barel with a rope and Geraldine with a striped tie found in place around her neck. Although Evans was tried for the murder of baby Geraldine alone, much of the evidence concerned the death of Barel. John Christie was the key witness for the prosecution, but he also found himself on the defense. During the trial, he had to explain his own criminal background before the court.
Christie had more than just a dubious past. He'd previously been convicted of theft and beating a woman with a cricket bat. Timothy Evans' defense team hoped to highlight Christie's criminal past and portray him as the real murderer.
You were shown this tie at the police station, is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked if you recognized the tie or something like that? I understand you said no.
No, I did not recognize it.
Did you say anything to the police about the tie to connect it with Evans?
I think I did say that I'd seen Mr. Evans wearing a striped tie, but I could not say whether this was the one or not.
What is the point of telling the police you had seen Evans wearing a striped tie if you could not say if it was that tie or not?
But I was asked if I'd noticed what type of tie Mr. Evans used, and I said that I had seen him wearing a red one very frequently, but I had seen him wearing a striped tie. But what the stripe was, I could not recollect.
I see. Did you tell the police that it was not your tie? You're wearing a striped tie now, aren't you?
Yes.
Well, I've got to suggest to you, Mr. Christie, and I do not want there to be any misapprehension about this, that you are responsible for the death of Mrs. Evans and that young baby, or, if that is not so, that you know very much more about those deaths than you have said.
That is a lie.
You are not, are you, a man of good character?
Well, I had some trouble.
On 4 occasions, you have been convicted of offences of dishonesty, have not you?
3.
Then perhaps I had better put them to you. Were you sentenced to 3 and 3 months imprisonment concurrent in 1921 for stealing postal orders? Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember that.
Bound over for false pretences in 1923. Do you remember that? At Halifax.
Yes, I remember that.
9 months hard labour for stealing material and goods at Uxbridge in 1924.
Yes.
And 3 months imprisonment and various fines with an alternative of prison, again at Uxbridge, for stealing a motor car in 1933. Surely, Mr. Christie, you could remember that? 4 offences of dishonesty.
I had an idea it was 3.
Here we have a sort of a soft-spoken, respectable man who's seen war service. He's been a part-time policeman. He served in the First World War. So despite sort of minor offences, he would seem to be a good witness. And so he is accepted.
I think the main reason Christie was believed was his wife, because she did seem like a good woman. She backed up his story 100%, you know? And the fact that Tim and Barel had argued a lot vocally, other people had heard the arguments, was easy to go that, you know, to make Tim look like the murderer.
Evans' defense team were unable to land a knockout blow against John Christie, though. The prosecution had little difficulty in painting Evans as the liar he clearly was. Even Evans himself seemed at times to become confused between his different confessions, and he could offer no motive for why Christie would kill his wife or child.
Is it true that on 5 different occasions, at different places and with different persons, you have confessed to the murder of your wife and child?
I have confessed it, but it is not true. I was upset.
Is it right that you have confessed it 5 times at different places and with different people?
Yes, it is.
Are you saying that on each of those occasions you were upset?
The biggest part of them, sir.
I beg your pardon?
Well, for the last one I was.
If you were not upset the other times, then why did you confess to willful murder, unless it was true?
I knew my wife was dead, but I did not know my daughter was dead.
What did that got to do with it?
It has a lot to do with it.
Is that a reason for pleading guilty to murder? Because you're upset because your daughter is dead by some other person's hand?
Yes.
Is it?
Yes.
I see. Let us just look at these occasions. It is you who voluntarily go to the police station on the 30th of November after you have read a letter from your mother to your aunt.
That is right.
It was because in the letter your previous lies had been exposed that you decided to go to the police, was it?
It was not because of the lies.
Why then did you suddenly go to the police?
I was worried about my daughter.
Are you saying that seriously to the jury? That you go to the police and confess to murder because you're worried about the whereabouts of your daughter?
The trial only lasted 3 days. The odds had been stacked against Evans from the very start. His habit of providing false testimony proved critical, and the jury produced their verdict in under an hour.
Timothy John Evans, the jury has found you guilty of willful murder. The sentence of the court upon you is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that you will be hanged by the neck until dead, and your body buried in the precinct of the prison in which you shall be last confined before execution. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
When the guilty verdict was delivered for Timothy Evans, John Christie burst into tears. Was it relief that he was off the hook? Well, for the time being at least.
A devastated Timothy Evans made an appeal on the 20th of February. It was dismissed. There would be no reprieve for the young man.
Timothy Evans was hanged on the 9th of March, 1950. When Christie's crimes came to light, doubt suddenly fell on the verdict. I mean, was it really conceivable that two stranglers lived under the same roof?
What seems more probable by far is that in November 1949, John Christie, already a double murderer, added two more to his gruesome tally. The great tragedy of the case was the fact that Christie's first two victims were not discovered buried in the back garden when the police found the remains of Barel and Geraldine Evans. The bodies of Ruth First and Muriel Eady lay buried just a few feet away. In fact, a femur bone was later found propping up a fence.
This miscarriage of justice would cause debate for decades and form a major part of the push to end capital punishment. But on the 9th of March 1950, not only had one man been wrongfully executed, the real killer had got away scot-free. His terrible crimes were yet to be discovered, and more were to come.
In Timothy Evans, Christie found an easy scapegoat. Police failings in the prosecution and the fact that the other bodies buried in the garden were somehow undiscovered meant that all suspicion surrounding Christie disappeared. He was now free to find new victims, and the events which followed would shock the nation. The murder of Muriel Eady gave Christie his modus operandi: poisoning, physical and sexual assault, and then strangulation. This sexual violence almost certainly empowered and intoxicated the usually impotent Christie. With the killings of Barel and Geraldine Evans, 10 Rillington Place was already known as a house of death. But the notoriety of this address would only grow as Christie would find new prey. His next unwitting victim, however, would be very close to home.